Okay, and that was perfect timing apparently. We are ready to start the last session of this particular morning track. Artturi Lehtio is going to present, he's going to talk about command and control as a service, and you're going to learn about what else, apart from Twitter, you can use to control your botnets. All right, over to you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Like you just heard, I'm Artturi Lehtio. I work as a researcher at F-Secure. And today I'll be talking about C&C-as-a-Service, abusing third-party web services for malware command and control. So, well, most of you are probably familiar with network-level detection and blocking of malware. It's often seen as a scalable and a cost-effective way of identifying malicious activity in organizations' networks. A big part of that is detecting and blocking command and control traffic. So the malware communicating with the command and control servers. But of course, the better we as defenders get at detecting and blocking that traffic, the attackers will try and come up with new ways of hiding that traffic, trying to evade our detections. And there are a lot of ways they can try and hide, but probably the most obvious is to encrypt the traffic one way or another and try and hide it that way. This quote is from the malware report from the first half of this year from Motive Security Labs. And there's two interesting details here. First, it seems we aren't very good at detecting and blocking network traffic, since only 2.6% of malware that they've seen actually even bothers to encrypt the C&C traffic. But what's a lot more interesting from my point of view is that they go on to say that even for the encrypted traffic, most of that they could still detect just by inspecting it, regardless of the encryption. And in the report, they list some reasons for detecting that. They talk about unique identifying characteristics of the initial handshake, for instance, or for the key exchange. And they say that they sometimes see malware that uses its own crypto, it's rolled its own cryptography, and the result is fixed binary content in the encrypted traffic, and they're able to use that to detect it. But we all know rolling your own crypto is a bad idea. Why not use something like HTTPS, SSL, let others bother with the difficult stuff and use that? And well, malware does that as well. So in the infamous Office of Personnel Management hack, according to news reports, it took officials 11 months from the initial breach to actually detect malicious activity on their networks. And even when they did detect it, that was mainly because they were able to intercept SSL traffic and decrypt it and look at the actual content. And this is something that Motive also notes in their report. So what Motive says as well is that standard crypto, something like SSL, for instance, is more difficult to detect. But again, interestingly, they say that they can oftentimes accurately identify the malware simply based on the IP or DNS, or based on the IP address or the domain name. So essentially, even though they don't have visibility into the content, they're able to use the metadata to identify that it's malicious activity. So what then is all this fuss about? There's Russian cyber warriors hiding on Twitter, or the world's most sophisticated cyber weapon. These are sensationalist headlines from media like Foreign Policy and Financial Times. But another thing these have in common is that in all of these cases, the malware related to the incidents that are being reported, the malware has used third-party web services as its command and control channel. Services like these, for instance. They might have used comments on Microsoft TechNet, or they might have used tweets or Facebook posts or something like Dropbox, for instance. And basically, any web service that in one way or another allows users to store and retrieve content can be abused as a command and control channel. And one of the reports that the previous headlines refer to is a recent report from FireEye, where in the conclusions they also note this. And so they also say that malware that employs legitimate web services is a lot harder for defenders to note. But what then makes it so much harder? Well, the first challenge that I've kind of hinted at already is the fact that if they're using proper crypto, something like SSL for instance, you can't use the content to identify or discern between malicious and non-malicious traffic. There's an exception, of course, if you're using active interception of SSL, but that's its own can of worms with its own problems. But if you don't want to get into that, then you can't look at the content. You have to rely on the metadata. But if the traffic's going to Twitter or Facebook or Google servers, for instance, how do you know when it's malicious traffic, and how do you know when it's just your users using Google Docs, for instance, or even Google searches? Basically, there aren't many good options. Of course, some organizations can also do policies to limit the attack surface, for instance, ban file sharing services or ban social media, but I highly doubt there's any organization that is willing to enact a policy that bans all third-party web services or all web services. So that probably isn't going to help too much. And while this is a problem for detecting and for preventing these types of things and noticing when something bad has happened, it's also a problem for incident response. Because traditionally you could look at NetFlow or traffic logs or PCAPs both to figure out what's happened and what they did, what did they steal, but also, for instance, if you have a known command and control server, you could look for other hosts in your networks connecting to that same server. But again, if you don't have visibility into the content, you rely on the metadata. But if the metadata just says that there's traffic going to Twitter, how do you know which hosts are infected and which hosts just belong to people who like to use Twitter? Then there's also other challenges, for instance, related to takedowns. It's not that there aren't other options, it's more that the traditional methods or traditional techniques won't work, and we have to come up with new ways. Because traditionally, if you knew there was a malicious server, you'd try and collaborate with the hosting provider or with certs or law enforcement and have the server taken down. But if that server belongs to Twitter, they probably don't want to take the entire server down. Of course, you can work with them, and they'll most likely help to remove the known malicious accounts. But while you spend a month going through the bureaucracy and finding the contacts and communicating, these are services that are designed to generate as many new users as possible. So the registration process, the sign-up process, takes half a minute or a minute maybe. So by the time you spent a month working with Twitter to get the account taken down, they could have, they could have registered as many new accounts as they want. So it's not a scalable option in that sense. And similar issues with sinkholing as well, which often helps, for instance, in identifying how big a problem some malware campaign, for instance, is, when you can see how many victims are contacting the command and control server by sinkholing the domain. But again, if the domain is dropbox.com or twitter.com, you can't sinkhole that. So you can't use those traditional methods or traditional techniques. You have to come up with new options. But then what does this look like in practice? Well, at its simplest, it's surprisingly simple, actually. Because in many cases, malware doesn't even have to rewrite or malware authors don't need to rewrite the command and control protocols. They can just route it through legitimate services, proxy it through services. Like, for instance, the case of backdoor Macadox, a malware from 2012, I think Symantec published about, which actually routes its command and control traffic via Google Docs. But there's a nice little feature in Google Docs called Viewer, that allows you to pass it an arbitrary URL. And Google will go and fetch the resource at that URL, and it will present it back to you. So in a sense, what the malware does is it will ask Google to contact the command and control server. So on the victim network, all you'll see is traffic going to Google's servers, but the malware will actually get the same response back from the command and control server. But that means you lose all of the visibility suddenly. And since it's SSL, you don't see the URL parameters. You just know it's going to Google, but you have no idea if it's legitimate use of Google Docs or whether it's malicious. But of course, this is a simple example. There are a lot more complex use cases as well. For instance, using third-party services to establish a command and control channel, where when a malware wants to connect to its command and control server, it will first connect to a third-party service, fetch some resource that tells it where the actual command and control server is. So usually it will receive, or it will find an IP address, for instance, for the current active command and control server, and then it will connect to that via some other means. And the benefit, of course, is that if the actual command and control server is taken down or the IP is blocked, the attackers just set up a new server, do a new tweet or post a new comment or whatever, and next time the malware is trying to connect to a command and control server, it will get the new updated IP address or domain name. An example, for instance, is Yanikab, also known as Duck, which first surfaced as a backdoor written in Python on OS X, and then later it was rewritten in VBS for Windows. And it would use, for instance, YouTube comments, where the number in the comment will be divided by a constant, and that's actually, or converted to hexadecimal, and that's the hexadecimal representation of the IP address. And it didn't just use YouTube, it used blog post comments as well, and it even used the ever-trendy Google Plus in some cases. And there's a lot of examples of malware that does this with a variety of services, anything like Microsoft TechNet comments or Google Code, Google Groups, blogging services, Facebook. Even in the case of Foxy, it used a Russian social media site for the same purposes. And again, this isn't a new thing. There's, for instance, this bulletin from Dell about a botnet that SonicWall researchers had found that used Twitter, Yahoo, and Tumblr as part of its command and control mechanisms. And this report is from 2009. So it's an old problem in some sense as well. But of course, even in these cases, there is still an actual command and control server that they connect to. But there are lots of cases as well where the malware doesn't rely on any attacker-operated servers at all. It will rely entirely on those third-party services. Now, I haven't been able to collect nice screenshots of this in action, but luckily NSA is good at collecting a lot of things, and Edward Snowden helps us here. This is a slide that Snowden leaked from NSA that shows Byzantine Hades, a Chinese APT group, in 2009 using Facebook, where the malware will do a Facebook or post to Facebook, and then the attackers will reply to that with new commands. And again, there are a lot of other examples of this as well, things like file sharing services, for instance, OneDrive or CloudMe being used, or webmail services. An interesting case here is the APT1 samples, or Glooksmail and Macromail, which used Google Talk and MSN Messenger respectively, where those are simple backdoors, just remote access tools, almost like SSH into the victim. And of course, for that, it's nice to have a responsive protocol and responsive way of interacting with the victims. And that's always an engineering challenge. But instant messaging services have spent a lot of effort solving that problem, trying to make it as real-time as possible. So what they do is they'll use Google Talk or MSN Messenger and let Google and Microsoft handle the difficult engineering parts of it, and they'll just abuse that to their benefit. And there's also a lot of academic papers where researchers have been looking at how Twitter might be used as a command and control channel. And also, this isn't just a desktop problem. There's a lot of mobile malware, for instance, using push notification services, Baidu Cloud Push or Google Cloud Messaging, where again, keeping a network connection open to a roaming mobile device it's a difficult engineering challenge, but push notification services try and solve that problem. So why not benefit from that? Use push notification services to push the commands to the mobile devices, and then those mobile devices can reply again. Now, there's also cases where it's not the primary channel, but if the primary C&C doesn't respond, the malware might use or fall back to a backup channel that is based on a third-party service. For instance, there's a case like OnionDuke, which if it's unable to connect to its primary command and control server, it'll look for tweets from specific Twitter accounts. It'll look for links in those tweets, and the links will lead to nice images like this publicly available desktop wallpaper, except at the end of the file there's a identifier, and then there's a ASCII hexadecimal string, and when that's converted to binary and decoded with a XOR key, you suddenly have a new binary or a PE file, new version of OnionDuke, and it will run that. And again, there are lots of other examples as well using a variety of different services for this. Things like CozyDuke or Flashback, which both use Twitter as a backup mechanism as well. Or downloaders, nymphs used Tumblr. And in some of these cases, it will be a hard-coded Twitter account, for instance. But in many cases, they'll have a kind of a DGA algorithm. They'll generate a account name based on the current date and look at that. So it's one form of domain generation algorithms, or kind of ported to this sort of methods. There's one more use case I'd like to touch upon, which is third-party services for exfiltration, where large amounts of data going out of a network or especially if it's going to an unknown or not a well-known service, it's quite suspicious. But what if that data is going to Microsoft OneDrive or Dropbox or some common file sharing service? It's suddenly a lot less suspicious, because those are services people use for precisely the purpose of uploading data there. And for instance, CozyDuke and HammerDuke, both, they have other means of communicating with the command and control server, but once the attackers decide they want to start exfiltrating data, or they've decided what data they want to steal, they'll actually use Microsoft OneDrive and transfer the data to OneDrive instead of over the primary command and control protocol. So quick recap, there's a variety of use cases or ways of abusing third-party services, simple things like proxying or just to help establish a primary C&C channel, but also as various kinds of command and control channels, primary or backup, or as an exfiltration channel, for instance, and of course all kinds of combinations of the above. And if you're interested, there's a lot more examples and links in the paper, so do go and read through those as well. Lots of interesting cases that have been documented over the years. But despite all of these challenges, not to get too depressed, there's also a lot of opportunities, new things that we can actually do or benefit from this. For instance, we can't sinkhole, and we can't do takedowns or forensic dumps of command and control servers, so it's harder to get data on who the victims are or how many victims there are. So we can't monitor that, but we can monitor the attackers, because something like Twitter, for instance, it's public. So we can just go and look at the tweets there. Plus, compared to a case where the malware or the attackers operate the C&C server themselves, they can, if they're good or if they're careful, they'll look at the logs and try and see if researchers start poking at their servers. But if the service is something like Twitter, they don't see that. So they don't know they're being monitored. They don't know they're being watched, which is a big benefit for us. And so it allows us to track them a lot easier, because we can basically passively monitor them instead of actively poking at their infrastructure, for instance. Another similar opportunity is statistics that a lot of services actually make publicly available. Things like, in this case, it's Janikab that I mentioned earlier, which used YouTube comments. And well, YouTube shows you how many views the video has had and how that's evolved over time. And so you can try and use that to estimate how many victims there might actually be. And these are openly available statistics that you can just browse on YouTube, for instance. And a similar opportunity is also related to the historical research. So, this is a quote from Symantec's blog post. They talk about Trojan groups or that's what they call it, the Trojan that uses Google News groups as its command and control server. So the malware will post a new message to the news group, and then the attackers might reply with new commands. And then in this case, there was also a kind of a constant posting that had initial commands for the malware. And as Symantec notes in the blog post, all of those postings are stored there, so they were able to go back and read through all of the connections from all the different malware, look at all of the information that the different victims or malware from different victims had posted there. And even more usefully, Google News Groups provides version control. So they were able to go back and look at how the commands had changed over time and how the attackers had modified those. And in this case as well, Google News Groups also provide statistics for the public to see. So again, they were able to use that as well to try and gauge how many victims there might be or how big of a problem this might be. So again, it's a different kind of opportunity, something that hasn't been as possible or isn't as possible with more traditional cases of command and control servers operated by the attackers, where if they're good or if they're smart, they'll clean up after themselves, and once you get the forensic dump, there's actually not that much historical data for you to collect. There's also one more opportunity, one that I like to call God mode, which is an interesting case where these service providers, they have amazing visibility into their services, and sometimes they can use that to their advantage. For instance, there's a quote from a report by Blue Coat on what they call the Inception framework, also known as Cloud Atlas, where the malware would use a file sharing service or a cloud storage provider, CloudMe, as the command and control channel. And once the researchers started working with the service provider, they notified them that we've seen this malicious activity and we've seen that this account is being used to channel commands from malware. CloudMe actually went through their log data and they were able to identify over 100 other accounts that seemed to be related. So they were able to use all of the visibility they have into their services, into their activities, and use that to help researchers. So again, there are a lot of opportunities. If you get the service providers to collaborate, you can actually gain a lot more than might be possible with just getting NetFlow data for a hosted server or getting a forensic dump, which is, it's just a snapshot and you have no way of knowing whether right next door there's another, or in the same hosting provider there's actually another server on a close IP address, but you have no way of identifying that, or not as easily. Whereas in this case it was apparently surprisingly easy to identify a lot of related cases. So there are challenges, cases or things that we're used to doing or techniques we're used to using that don't work anymore or might not work the same way. Things like takedowns or sinkholing, for instance, especially takedowns where it's different from what it is with traditional mechanisms. It's still possible, but in different ways. Some cases like the network level detection and blocking, or also for incident response where you lose a lot of the visibility or all of the visibility in some cases. But there's also opportunities for easier monitoring of the attackers, more statistics, more historical data, even in some cases God mode, which also helps a lot. So in conclusion, like I mentioned, the oldest examples I've shown are from 2009, and those certainly, or I'm certain they weren't the first times that someone suddenly thought of this. So it's not a new thing. It's been going on for a while, but it hasn't caught on yet. It's not become a big thing yet, and so it's not become a big problem either. There are already a lot of targeted attacks, for instance, or malware used in targeted attacks that do this type of stuff, that abuse third-party services for command and control channels, but it's not caught on yet. It brings new challenges, but it also brings new opportunities. And again, it's not a case of all hope is lost now. It's more a case of understanding that which techniques won't work and finding replacements, finding other methods of accomplishing similar things. And it's definitely something that should be taken into account when designing defenses, whether if you're defending a specific network, for instance, thinking of what if the malware, for instance, what if the malware uses third-party services? How do you find all of the infected hosts in your network? But also if you're designing tools to help others protect, again, how do you work around the problem of losing this type of visibility? And for instance, in this case, you lose a lot of visibility on the network, but on the endpoints, for instance, it's not such a big problem. So on the endpoints, if you see explorer.exe, for instance, connecting to Facebook, that's probably still suspicious. But on the network, you don't know that. And I think this is something that deserves more attention, deserves more research. There's probably a lot more that could be done to detect this type of stuff. We just have to find that out. Things like Sebastian Garcia's talk on Wednesday of new ways of identifying malicious network activity, for instance, or improved techniques on endpoints, things like that, where we might be able to work around these problems. So hopefully I've got a new thinking about these types of things, and hopefully we can come up with new solutions, new ways of working around some of the challenges, and new ways of using these opportunities to our advantage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Artturi. I think we have some time for questions. Does anyone have questions for? All right. Wait for the microphone, please. There you go.
It's more comment than a question. A lot of what you said requires you as a defender to look inside in and outgoing encrypted traffic. And when it comes to inspecting SSL, I would like to, since some of the people in the room might be in a position and have products that do that, I'd like to call attention to a talk from the CCC camp back in August by the German guy Hanno. The talk was called SSL Inspection is Considered Harmful. You should check it out.
Thank you for your comment. Any questions from the room? Oh, yeah, there's one more question, yeah.
So say that I'm a web service provider and somebody is using me for this C&C stuff. What is my liability? I mean, how much leverage do we have in those folks so that they cooperate, provide the data?
I'm not a lawyer, so don't base your decisions on this. But my understanding of from looking at cases where this has happened, the service providers are usually happy to cooperate. It's more down to they'll take down the accounts. That's usually a given. But then how much data they, for instance, they might be willing to provide to you, that depends a lot on their privacy policies and EOLAs and all of that related to their customers. So that's sometimes or often a challenge. But then there's something like CloudMe, for instance, which apparently was very happy to collaborate, and their CEO turned it into a nice PR speech because he was saying our service is so trustworthy and so good that even the bad guys want to use our service. So they used it as a marketing trick as well.
Excellent. Do we have time for one more question? No. Okay. Thank you very much, Artturi.
Thanks.